So as we move along and get closer to actually starting to record some things, next I want to talk about those interfaces that we mentioned in the terms, the MIDI interface and the audio interface. And these are the main centerpieces of our home recording environment. And first I want to talk about MIDI interfaces. And as I mentioned in our terms and definitions, the MIDI protocol is only a language that communicates musical information back between devices. And many manufacturers subscribe to the MIDI protocol, so it's built into a lot of the equipment that you may use that has MIDI functionality. So in today's modern recording world, the connections is really one of the main differentiators between some of the devices that you may buy. The most common is a MIDI interface, which is just a keyboard, similar to the one I have right in front of me here. And like I mentioned before, there's no sound inside this. This is literally just a controller that triggers sound. Now we're going to get into setting up the DAW and recording and looking at all the instruments later. But very quickly, I've got in Luna, the recording system I'm using in front of me here today, a virtual instrument of a piano, okay? And so by simply plugging this MIDI controller in, this MIDI keyboard via USB, it automatically is recognized by the computer, it's recognized by the software that we're using, and it's pretty much ready to go. It's very plug and play, and that's the best news. So once you pull up an instrument that can receive the MIDI signals transmitted from the keyboard, it's ready to go, okay? So it's pretty plug and play. Now, some of the other MIDI interfaces, that are more old school, for lack of a better word, they might have many ports. So for example, you can see some of the synthesizers that I have behind me and keyboards that are actually sound modules, some of the traditional synths that have sound on board. They may need a MIDI cable, which is that 5-pin proprietary cable, okay, that you plug into the synth and then into your MIDI interface. And over to the left of me, I have more of an old school 8-channel MIDI interface so that I can plug in some of my synthesizers that I have and utilize not only the MIDI, but the audio from those devices as well. And again, most common is synthesizers. So in that case, what we need to remember, MIDI is only transmitting the MIDI musical information, no audio. Then totally separately from the MIDI connection, we would have to have the synth outputs set up to whatever audio interface that we have to receive the audio output. So in that case, we'd have two signals going independently. The MIDI transmitting the musical information of what you're playing, and then the sound outputting of the device that we get into our interface. We're going to get into audio interfaces next. But that, in a nutshell, is MIDI. Very easy to use. When we get into looking at DAWs and the recording, we'll look at how that can get translated inside your recordings. But that's basically all we need to know at the beginning in terms of MIDI interfaces. Next up is audio interfaces. And there's a lot of considerations to be made when you're getting into looking to purchase an audio interface. And one of the first connections is how many inputs and outputs do you need? Or what's the I/O, input-output, configuration that you want? If you're a guitar player and that's all you mainly do, a 2-channel interface may be perfect. If you're a band and you have, or you're a drummer and you have lots of microphones that you're going to want to mic up the entire drum kit, or if you want to record the entire band, you might need an 18 or a 16-channel interface. And so one of the first considerations is how much I/O do you think you'll need or that you'll want in the future? There's a lot of people that say, oh, I'm just going to get a little 2-channel interface, but forget that, you might do a vocal, have a microphone plugged in, you might have a guitar, and then if you bring one other thing in, like a keyboard or something, you're going to be out of inputs. And so you're constantly going to be swapping the cables. So it just depends on what kind of a configuration you want and what one you think you'll need in the future. Another consideration is the connectivity. So how does the interface connect to your computer? Interfaces can be USB, they can be Thunderbolt. Some of the older ones are Firewire. And so it depends on what computer you're using the interface with and the fastest connection possible to you. Most of the fastest ones today are using Thunderbolt. It's a very fast transfer protocol because there's a lot happening in the interface that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But having a very good connection and one that's compatible with your computer is very important. Next up are some of the tech specs, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but just give you an idea of some of the technical specifications that differentiates a lesser entry-level interface with a more expensive interface. And the good news is really at any budget you can get phenomenal quality. Again, it's going to depend on how many inputs or outputs you need. If you need larger input options and you want high quality, then that'll clearly be more expensive than, say, a 2-channel version that has better internal specifications. Some of the tech specs that we talk about when we're recording digital audio and recording into a computer is something called bit depth. And bit depth, not to get too technical, is just relates to the conversion into the digital process. And it relates to dynamic range. So we talked a little bit about dynamic range and headroom. So how much dynamic range does your system have? We want the most dynamic range possible, and we want to be able to record pretty loud signals in a very high quality. In today's recording world, 24-bit is the specification that is recommended for the highest quality bit depth. Okay, now there are other formats out there, but they're not as widespread as 24-bit. But if you're looking at an interface, you want to make sure that it can go up to a 24-bit bit depth. All right, below that is 16-bit, and below that is 8-bit. Without getting too technical, once you go down to 16 or 8-bit, you're dramatically reducing the dynamic range that you can record with that interface. Most of the good ones out there today do go up to at least 24-bit or can go up to 24-bit, okay? Next up is sample rate. That is another process, another aspect of recording digitally, and think of sample rate as a constant audio signal, like my voice right now talking or a guitar. When there's sound happening, there is the waveform of that happening, okay? And what we do when we plug a instrument or a microphone into an interface is we are taking that analog audio signal and converting it to digital. Now, the way that the interface does that is it takes little snapshots of the audio coming in. And so each snapshot, all right, is considered a sample. And so the sample rate is how many snapshots of the audio are being taken as you're recording, okay? Common numbers in this specification are 44.1, 48K, 96K, and by K I mean 1,000, so 96,000, 192, and so on and so forth. So 44.1 is kind of the lower end, you know, beginning level of digital sampling for a recording system. And then 192K or 192,000 sample rate is at the upper end. And what that means is each number is how many samples are being taken per second. So at 48K, a sample rate of 48K, the digital interface is taking 48,000 snapshots of that audio at once, every second. Now what that means is higher quality. Okay, so all of that technical jargon aside, the recommended sample rate is 48K. Now some people still do 44.1. It sounds good, but the recommended is 48K. And then some of the real higher end recordings that are happening, maybe with orchestral stuff, or some of the higher end engineers and producers are using the higher sample rates of 192. And so as you shop for an interface, looking at the sample rates that it can record in is very important, but you want to make sure 48K is one of those. To get a little bit under the hood of interfaces, let's talk about conversion. Now, one of the biggest price differences when you get to lower priced interfaces and then higher priced interfaces is the quality of conversion. So we just talked a second ago about sample rate. That is the interface or the digital converter taking snapshots of the audio. Now that requires a very stable and precise clock to make sure that happens precisely. So as it relates to price, it's no different than buying a watch. If you buy a really cheap watch for really cheap money, it probably doesn't tell as good a time, especially in an analog watch. It probably doesn't tell as good a time as a super fancy expensive watch that you could set, wind it up real good, put it in a drawer, get it out a month later, and it's still got the precise time because of the mechanics, because of the internal workings, because of the way it was designed. And so clearly there's a difference between a cheap watch and a very expensive watch, okay? Similarly with interfaces, the clock that's inside and some of the components that we don't need to get into make up for the quality of that conversion process. And so the ability for a converter, based on a clock and other things, to convert analog to digital, or A to D, and then digital to analog, D to A, the quality at which that happens depends on a lot of things under the hood. And so we just want to make sure that the interface that we choose has a good converter inside. And you can, this is a specification that's a little tougher to get. You got to kind of dig deep into the manufacturers. But if you are looking at interfaces and one from one company is more expensive than the other, just know that there's probably a good reason for that. In addition to A to D and D to A to converters, there's also the noise floor, or the harmonic distortion that any interface has. And what that is when there's no sound, how noisy is that interface? Does it introduce any noise into the signal? Again, components and the quality of components are what makes that be noisy or more quiet. And you can actually look at the specifications of an interface and look at the harmonic distortion, and we want the lower harmonic distortion. That's going to be a quieter noise floor, and that's going to make sure we're just getting a really clean sound with the minimal amount of added noise to any signal. Okay, so again, that's another important specification to talk about, is the noise floor and harmonic distortion. And last is dynamic range. We talked a little bit about it with bit depth. Again, the quality components are going to affect the price of the interface. And just knowing that it can go up to 24-bit and reading a little bit about the converters are going to help make sure that you have plenty of dynamic range to record nice quality recordings. Okay, so that's a little bit kind of under the hood of interfaces of what's going on. And now let's talk about some specific interfaces. We're partnering on these videos with Universal Audio. I'm a very, very big fan of Universal Audio. I've been using lots of their equipment for many, many years. And I have with me the Apollo Solo, which is Universal Audio's 2-channel interface. And this is a wonderful interface that has many, many features that we're going to talk about here. But based on what we just talked about, this is a 2-channel, very high quality interface that you can use. It's got wonderful converters inside, world-class conversion process from analog to digital. Not only that, it's got phenomenal monitoring, whether you're using headphones like I have here. You can plug the headphones right in the front, and you can switch between headphones. It also has monitoring if you're monitoring on speakers, and it just has very high quality monitor outputs for listening to your signals. And it also has 2 inputs and 2 outputs. You can also plug in the front direct, a DI, direct like a guitar, which is what we're going to do. And then you have other features that are common on here, like phantom power for powering up a condenser microphone. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. It's got a pad, it's got a phase invert, and a high pass filter. And I also have, that I've had for years now, is an Apollo 8-channel interface over in the rack. And I use that for tracking additional things like synths, or sometimes I'll send signal out to actual analog outboard gear. And so I have an 8-channel Apollo sitting right over there. And one of the great things about the Universal Audio system is that you can add interfaces and stack them up and link them. So right now I have the Solo attached to the Apollo, all in the Universal Audio software that links those devices. And so it kind of acts like one interface, if you will. So I have all the expandability of this. And this is wonderful because another feature of the Solo is that it's totally portable. So I can take this with me on the road. I can take it inside. I can use it on a laptop wherever I'm at. And it's completely portable. I can come home, plug it into this system here, and it expands my system here. So it's a wonderful system, the Apollo from Universal Audio. Other features that are wonderful about any of the Apollo interfaces is near zero latency. So we talked about latency in our terms, and that is that delay and the time it takes for audio to go through the entire system. So with these interfaces, there's next to zero latency. So whether you're tracking real guitars, live, vocals, synths, anything you're tracking live, you'll be able to do that with no latency and no delay, which makes it much easier to record. All right. Also, the universal audio interfaces all have the UAD DSP plugin processing. And this is a phenomenal plugin architecture that has the digital signal processing actually inside the interfaces. So that's one of the key features of UAD plugins, is that the plugins are not actually on your computer taking up the resources and the processing, bogging down your computer. They actually do all of that mathematical calculation that we talked about in our terms on the interfaces, which is phenomenal. But in addition to that, Universal Audio offers hundreds of wonderful world-class emulations of analog gear. And when you get any of the interfaces, they come with some of those plugins. So for example, this little solo interface here comes with the real-time analog classic bundle, which has things like that 610B preamp that we talked about, the plugin emulation, a Marshall Plexi classic amplifier, the Teletronics LA2A legacy, two 1176 compressors, a Pultec EQP1A, the Ampeg classic bass amp, modulation, distortion, and reverb. It all comes with the interface. So you get introduced to the UAD platform, and right out of the box, you have some phenomenal world-class plugins that are used on many, many high-end recordings right out of the box. Another feature that comes with Universal Audio Apollo interfaces is access to their recording system, which is called Luna. And if you're using Apollo with a Thunderbolt connection on a Mac, Luna is Universal Audio's new music production application that utilizes zero latency and ARM technology, which is something that we're going to talk about, and also gives you access to what they call the Unison preamps inside your interface. And that allows you to, again, incorporate those analog emulations. And real quick about Unison, when you plug an instrument or a mic into one of these Apollo interfaces, the Unison technology allows you to bring up those Universal Audio UAD emulation plugins and actually run them as if you had the outboard version of that. And what I mean is, over there I've got the LA2A compressor, and a lot of times I'll have my vocal mic that I'm recording, and it'll go through my 610 preamp into the LA2A and then into my recorder. That 610 preamp and LA2A, the signal that gets warmed and processed from the microphone gets recorded as I record into my computer. And that's great because I get that warmth, I get that sound that I want, and then it's recorded and it is a part of the audio. All right. Sometimes when you use plugins, you record the dry signal and then you add the effect or add those things on top. But in this case, with Unison, you can pull up plugins and it's just as if you're running the signal through as you're recording, and it records the output of that processing into your DAW. And it's phenomenal because you can get the same results as some of that classic outboard gear. So it's very exciting with the technology that Universal Audio has available to us with UAD, with Apollo, and with Unison. And it just brings a world of super high-end recording techniques and technology, right at your fingertips. So with that, let's now start to get in on recording.